In today's guided practice, we're going to be looking at place value and the patterns. So one of the manipulatives that we're going to be using to look at our patterns today with place value is going to be our base 10 blocks. So if you will, you can pause the video if you don't already have your math book opened up to page 5, and this will be the top of your page. So our learning goal is how can you describe the relationship between two place value positions? So throughout the lesson you learned about place value positions and the relationship when you move from one to the other. So today we're going to dive a little bit deeper and we're going to apply that knowledge together. So as we learned in our previous lessons, the base 10 blocks are made up of small cubes, long, flats, and large cubes. So one small cube is worth 1, a long is worth 10, a flat is worth 100, and a large cube is worth 1,000. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the relationship between these 4 different values. And so what they represent is your ones place, your tens place, your hundreds place, and your thousands place. So if we're looking at our book, we're looking at part A. It says look at the long and compare it to the small cube. So if I were to look at my long, 10, my long equals 10, and my small cube equals 1. So that means that my long is 10 times as big as my small cube. If I were to multiply my small cube by 10, it would equal 10 and I would get a long. So the long is 10 times as much as the small cube. The next bullet point in your book says to look at the flat and compare it to the long. Well, my long is equal to 10 and my flat is equal to 100. So to go from 10 to 100, I'm multiplying by 10. 10 times 10 equals 100. So that means that my flat is 10 times as much as my long. And if I were to keep moving down my bullet list here, the next one asks me to look at my large cube and compare it to the flat. And my large cube is worth 1,000 and my flat is worth 100. And I know that to get from 100 to 1,000, I have to multiply by 10. So that means that my large cube is 10 times as much as my flat. So it looks like when you're moving from one place up to the next place, it's 10 times as much. Well, what happens when we're moving from a higher place value down to a lower place value? That's what we're going to be looking at in section B. So if I were to look at the flat and compare it to the large cube, again, my flat is worth 100 and my large cube is worth 1,000. And we learned up top to get from the flat to the large cube, it's 10 times as much. Well, what happens about the flat? So the flat is blank of the large cube. So if I'm looking at my large cube and my flat, how much of that large cube would my flat equal? Well, it would take 10 flats to equal a large cube because there's 100 in a flat and 1,000 in a large cube. So if I'm going to reverse it, flat would be 100 times 10 equals 1,000, but to get from my large cube, 1,000 to get down to my flat, which is 100, I would be dividing by 10. So my flat is 1/10 of my large cube. So my flat is only 1/10 of 1,000. 100 is only 1/10 of 1,000. And so we can continue with this pattern going down our place values. So next, let's look at our long and compare it to the flat. So if I'm looking at the difference between my long and my flat, the long is blank of the flat. So the long is only 1/10. It takes 10 longs to equal 100. So the flat is worth 100, so one long is only 1/10 of the flat because it takes 10 longs to equal a flat. And the same thing when we're looking at our cube and our long. It takes 10 small cubes to equal one long. So that means that a small cube is 1/10 of a long. So let's go ahead and flip over your book to page 6. we're going to take a look and see what kind of patterns we can find on page 6. So for numbers 1 and 2, thinking about the patterns from when you moved from a lesser place value up to a higher place value, and the pattern from moving from a higher place value to a lower place value. So when we were moving from a lower place value up to a greater place value, each place value increased times 10. So it was times 10 each time you jumped a place value. Now going down, so when you started at a greater place value and we moved down, it was 1/10 of the higher place value. So it was dividing by 10. So that's the patterns that we saw as we were moving from one place value to another. So let's go ahead and let's apply our knowledge of these patterns moving from one place value to the next. So down here under Make a Connection, it says you can use your understanding of place value patterns and a place value chart to write numbers that are 10 times as much or 1/10 of any given number. So what they've given us here is we have the number 300. So if we have the number 300 and we want to find a number that is 1/10 of 300 and a number that is 10 times as much as 300, we know that we're just moving place values. So an easy way that you can think of this is if I were to take 300 and multiply it by 10, that would give you 3,000. And if I were to take 300 and divide it by 10, that would give me 30. So if I were to look over here, blank is 10 times as much as 300. So 3,000 is 10 times as much as 300. That means if I were to multiply 300 times 10, I would get 3,000. And then what number is 1/10 of 300? Well, 30. 30 is 1/10 of 300. So now that we understand that relationship, we can use that pattern to complete our graph down here below. So we can think about some numbers. So if I have the number 10, so my 10 would fall right underneath the tens place on my chart. I want a number that is 10 times as much as 10. Okay? Or you can think about it as this number right here. 10 is 10 times as much as what number? So what number would you multiply by 10 to get 10? And that would equal 1. And then in this blank, what is 1/10? So 10 is 1/10 of what number? So this is where these get tricky. You have to really look at what they're saying. So it's saying 1/10, 10 is 1/10 of what number? So that means that if I were to take a number, divide it by 1/10, and it would equal 10. Well, that would be 100. So 1/10 of 100 equals 10. So go ahead and let's try number 70, because these words can be a little bit tricky, but once you get into the rhythm and of knowing what they're asking, then it's pretty simple. So if I have 70, this number here, 70, is 10 times as much as what number? So if I'm thinking of a number that I would multiply by 10 to get 70, well, that would be 7. 7 times 10 equals 70. So that's what you can think of. This row right here, you're multiplying it by 10, and that's going to give you your answer. This one right here, you're dividing by 10, and that would give you your number. So 7 times 10 equals 70. What number divided by 10 would equal 70? Well, that's only going one place value, so 700 divided by 10 would equal 70. So now I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and I want you to try 9,000. Okay, so hopefully you were able to pause the video and try 9,000. So what number times 10 would equal 9,000? If you wrote 900, you are correct. Now I need to find out what number, if I were to divide it by 10, would equal 9,000. So I would just go up one place value and it would be 90,000. All right, guys, go ahead and move on to your independent practice for today.